Okay, we're back on the Cold War II simulation game. This is, again, a free strategy game of the Cold War era that simulates the historical events surrounding the Cold War right after World War II. For today, we're going to focus on the same time period we looked at last time. We'll click the USA, and we will select the time frame 1949, 1945 to 1949, so right at the end of World War II. And we'll use normal and click Launch the game. Perfect. So the game kicks off right here. This part of the game kicks off right at the end of World War II, which of course we know tore Europe apart. It's the war's won by two groups of countries, really. You have the Western Allies and the Eastern Allies, and these groups had worked together to stop Nazi Germany from taking control of Europe. After the war, Europe needed to be rebuilt. So the Western Allies and the Eastern Allies could have worked together for this to happen, but as it turned out, there would be very little working together during the Cold War. As the countries that had been under Nazi control gained back their own power, the Allies had the opportunity to influence the way these countries would be run. And influence is a really key word when we talk about the Cold War that will develop even more. The Western Allies and the Eastern Allies had different ideas. The Western Allies, headed by the United States from our perspective, supported capitalism. And capitalism means that people own property and can make decisions about what they do with their property. The Eastern Allies were headed by the Soviet Union, and they supported communism. In communism, the government owns property and decides how people can use it. So the Allies began using their influence to convince countries to follow them, either capitalism or communism. A race developed between the United States and the Soviet Union so to see who could build the bigger sphere of influence. This race is called the Cold War, of course. And during the Cold War, the Soviet Union tried to expand its sphere of influence across Europe and Asia at the same time. The United States used its power to expand its own sphere of influence. And so, a sphere of influence is something that we're going to see in the game here. Now, historically, the United States believed that increasing capitalism could stop the growth of communism. And this is the strategy we've talked about called containment, because it would contain communism and keep it from spreading. Countries could pick one team or one side to join, and the more countries who chose capitalism, the less, of course, would choose communism. Now, we're going to talk more about this idea of sphere of influence in gameplay. So let's take a little bit more of a look here. So I'm going to hit close and go to the next screen. World War II is over. You've got 500,000 Allied and American soldiers occupying Japan. You know, what do we do when the war is over? Do we just pull all of our troops out and leave a vacuum? Or do we stay there and mobilize against communism? And that seems to be one of the choices that I would suggest we select. Here we've got President Truman. Now, when you look at this screen here, you see you have countries listed with plus or minus as your relationships go with them. Now, that has to do with your sphere of influence. How much influence do you have on them? Again, we'll come back to that. So I'll hit close. Okay, here in China, what should we do? If we hit, we already chose a side anyway, didn't we? We lose points here. We could say the talk should go on, so we'll keep talking. And it says our forces on both sides increase by +5. So obviously, in terms of gameplay, it's increasing our score. All right, so let's take a look at more detail for the game screen here. Now, first of all, as I shared, the game was developed in France. So as you scroll around, the country names are not translated, but I know you can figure out what they mean. USA and Canada look pretty good, but as you go into the Soviet Union, for example, you can see that the spelling of it is a French spelling, not an English spelling of the location. All right, so let's go through what we see in the screen, starting in the top right, and then we'll switch around and go to the left. The first thing we see here is something called DEF CON. And so DEF CON 1 all the way up to DEF CON 5. And so these are it's a warning system that was established by the United States, and it had to do with our defense readiness. Historically, the way it works is a 5 is very low, it's peacetime, and so you're at a peacetime readiness. 4 would be moderate, so increased security. This happens sporadically, historically, throughout the Cold War. 3 is substantial. This means our Air Force has to be ready within 15 minutes. This was used in right after September 11th in 2001. It was also happened in Yom Kippur in the Middle East in 1973. A 2 would be severe, means our army is ready to deploy within 6 hours. This happened in the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. And then 1 is critical. Nuclear war is imminent, and this has not happened. Now, if you were like me and you blasted through the game in speed play and you started the apocalypse and you had this mushroom cloud of smoke, that means you started a nuclear war and everybody dies. So congratulations, let's try to avoid that. All right, so the 15 you have here is the amount of money that you have to spend in the game. First flag here we have is China, then we have the Soviet Union, and then the United States, and obviously you can see your score here. If you click on China, it won't pop up yet. Soviet Union tells you it's Joseph Stalin. He has nerves of steel. He's a hawk, which means he's more in favor of war at times. And over here on the side, you see things that they can spend their money on. Now we can see the budget, we can see their armed forces, and we can see what are they working on. And so for research and development, that's what R&D means. It looks like they don't have the atomic bomb. Now for the United States, if we click on these, you've got Harry Truman, like Joseph Stalin, nerves of steel, and he's a hawk as reported by the game. If we click money, you can see we have a little more money, our military, and then our budget. So here we can actually start to work on increased weapons. So if I click the green here, it's going to have me start working towards the H-bomb, the hydrogen bomb, which would be more deadly than the atomic bomb. All right, I'm gonna close this screen. Okay, and as we look over here on the left-hand side, you've got world status and enemy activity. So right now the game is just starting, so there's nothing on the screen. By the way, to close these pop-ups, you just click either the choice or to the side of it. The zoom feature is really important, I think, for the game. So if you hit plus, you can zoom, then you can click right on the screen and drag it around. In the next segment we look at later on, we're going to pay a lot of attention to North and South of Korea. For today, we'll be looking at the line right in here where we start to have the Iron Curtain and the activities of the Eastern and Western allies really close to each other. The date over here, September 1945, is our start. The date, if it looks a little wonky, it's probably the French abbreviation for that month, but that's no problem. We'll be okay with that. All right, then we go down the side here. We look at some choices. The first one we have, this is color choices. So if I click it, it shows me across the bottom here, the politics. So, red for communism, blue for capitalism, or red for Soviet Union, blue for USA in terms of sphere of influence. And so that will change as the game progresses. The tank here shows areas of conflict. So the hotspots, if you will, if you were to click on maybe these blue tanks here, you can see what's going on here. And it uses this phrase, sphere of influence, which I'm going to come back to in a little bit. And we're also going to revisit this screen. Then you have something like in Spain, ES for España. Same idea, something's going on in Spain. It looks like it's turmoil. Great. Okay, down below we have more news and world events. It's going to give us alerts that it's very similar to what you'll see in this bar across the top. Then finally, across the bottom, just a layout of what it looks like for the Soviet Union and the United States on the global world map. Cool. All right, so let's click next here. Perfect. Okay, so it's saying, what do we want to do with Japan? Okay, well, Japan's an unexpected ally. I'm going to say no communists in Japan. And we'll hit close. Good. Okay, so here's our world status. You can see +4 as you scroll through, +3. So these are benefiting our scores. Red would be benefiting the Soviet Union. Blue would be benefiting the United States. All right, so here's how we're going to play the game a little bit differently. Instead of just blasting through the game like we had been doing previously, what we're going to do now is try to increase how we influence other countries so that we can try to get them to see things our way. So let's take a look, for example, let's go to Czechoslovakia. So if I click here, you can see Czechoslovakia is in the USSR sphere of influence. Now, traditionally, sphere of influence is broken up into three things: economic, military, and cultural. So, economic means we influence them through money. For example, if someone was trying to use economic influence to persuade, they might offer you gifts to impact the decision you're about to make. In foreign affairs, nations might give or take away money aid or access to resources to influence decisions made by other countries. So we can increase trade or stop trade. That's using money to influence. Military influence is a threat of an attack or a promise of protection. It's an example. For example, if someone wants to act like a bully, or they can offer to protect you from bullies. Either way, that's going to impact your decision. In foreign affairs, less powerful countries can be convinced to make certain decisions when they are under military influence of a more powerful nation. The last one out of our three is cultural. And a cultural influence is not really addressed in this game, honestly. Cultural influence is a nation's decision to process, they can also be affected by cultural forces like television or the internet, or, of course, radio. For example, when something or someone becomes really popular, you might be more likely to make decisions the way they want you to. In foreign affairs, countries with a really popular culture can use that to affect the way citizens in another country think. At least that's the idea. In the case of the Cold War, we see this happening in a couple of ways. Economically, we see the Soviet Union tries to get countries like Greece and Turkey to join them. In response, President Truman sends money to Greece and Turkey to help them improve their country, and this helped keep Greece and Turkey out of the Soviet Union's sphere of influence. A sphere is a circle, so circle of influence. It made them part of the U.S. sphere. After this action, they called using aid as influence the Truman Doctrine. Now, military influence is different. In the Cold War, sometimes you had flashes of hot war, so actual fighting. And one example of that is the Korean War. Communist countries helped Northern Korea attack Southern Korea. International groups joined together to help South Korea defend itself. The fighting lasted for more than 3 years until a ceasefire was reached, and the country was divided into North and South. This was an attempt to use military influence to expand the communist sphere of influence. Finally, again, cultural influence like propaganda plays a really big role in the Cold War. Propaganda is a message designed to persuade the listener to think a certain way. The Western Allies started Radio Free Europe to spread anti-communist propaganda, and the Soviet Union tried to block Radio Free Europe from being heard in its countries. Even so, aspects of culture like rock music broke out through the barrier to reach people living in communist nations. So that's what we're going to be looking at in this game is influence and how influence can cause one country to go towards the other. So, for example, in Czechoslovakia, if I wanted them to start to like the United States and have better relations, here you see it's bad, right? I could go, well, let's give them, I have $5 left. I'll give them $5. So I give them $5. I'm helping aid their country's development. And then let's see if that makes a difference later on. So I'll close this screen. I have no more money to spend here. So that means it's time to go to the next month. All right, so here's a little bit more about what's going on. Inside the US, you have pacifists, people who don't like fighting, are protesting. So it's actually hurting our score. Right, good. And I'm going to hit close and keep rolling. We've got 5 again to spend here. So let's take a look at home. We have an exclamation point. So I click right on that. That protesting is hurting us. Okay. Let's go to checking out world events, checking out areas of conflict. So for areas of conflict, now over here in the Philippines, you'll see, let's zoom in a little bit. I'll take you down here. You've got a plus, you've got a red and a blue interacting in the same screen. So that's kind of a highlight for us. So let's click on the blue there and let's see what we have going on. So right now they're average with both the USA and the USSR. Having control or the Philippines within our sphere of influence would benefit us strategically. So let's send some military aid. It looks good, seems like they like that. And then maybe some military action. That would be to recall, so let's leave that alone. Diplomacy, if we wanted to remove our bases or remove our aid, then we could do that as well. We're going to close that, leave it as it is. Okay, good. Let's go next. All right, we'll say we want to judge the emperor. Hit close, close. Excellent. Okay, I'm going to go back to this screen. Take a look at what we got going on here. So back to the Philippines as an example, I could add more aid, but I can also, for diplomacy, not just give money economically, but I can also remove it. So I could take away money I had sent them. I could stop trade with the money. So embargo would be to stop trade with the Philippines. I could ally myself with them. Subversion talks about actually trying to overthrow their current government by sending in people that will, like spies that would get involved in the culture and guerrilla groups to actually stop the government from going in a direction that we don't like. So that's something we could do. We could create opposition. Let's try that, creating opposition. The opposition starts to organize itself. That's a group against the government. So these are all examples of getting involved in a country through trying to influence what happens in that country. So your job is to go through this one section of the game or simulation with a little bit more effort and detail, paying attention to what's happening with your decisions. And let's see how you do, and post your score right in the Google Classroom stream that we have for the assignment. And we'll see how many of us can avoid the apocalypse and perhaps win the Cold War. Oh, one thing to note, when you get to a DEF CON screen that pops up, you have to kind of toggle between your choices. And so if the Soviet Union gets involved, you may actually have to decide whether or not you want to attack, or you might threaten a little bit, you might back off a little bit. And that's a really big screen when your DEF CON screen pops up, so be super careful with that. All right, have fun and try not to lose.